So I've already mentioned before that we were moving in the direction of priming more and more complex things. Now let's take a look at the very complex stuff, complex primes with relation to individualism and collectivism, and with regard to priming roles and goals. So first, individualism and collectivism. And here I want to tell you about a study where participants were asked to read a story about a general who had to choose a warrior to send to the king, or they didn't read the story, so that was the control condition. And participants in the condition where actually they did read the story were split again in two groups. So in the independent self-construal condition, the general, who was the main character of the story, chose the person who was the best individual for the job and considered the benefits to himself if he sent that person. And in the interdependent self-construal condition, the general chose a member of his own family and then therefore considered the benefits to his family in sending that person. And then afterwards, after being primed with these concepts versus in the control condition, participants were asked to complete a questionnaire on their endorsement of individualist versus collectivist values. So they were asked, how important are the following values to you on a 1 to 7 Likert type scale? And they were asked to rate the importance of values like freedom, independence, choosing one's own goals, living an exciting life, and living a varied life. And those would be values that would be typically more associated with individualism. On the other hand, they were also asked to rate goals that would be more associated with collectivism, like belongingness, friendship, safety of the family, national security, and respect for elders. We should also just take a minute to talk more about the concepts of individualism and collectivism, right? Just to make sure that everyone's on board, because not everyone might have heard about it. So these concepts come with the idea that they're largely different types of cultural expectations of what people emphasize and value. So that there is an expectation that there are cultures who value the promotion of one's own goals and aspirations, emphasizing individual gains. And this would be the individualism kind of cultures where there's also an independent construal of the self. So people think of themselves as an independent entity, as they think of themselves as an individual that is self-reliant, and is defined through personal traits and abilities and preferences, while in other cultures, collectivism plays a larger role, such that the group is emphasized, and these cultures then focus on the promotion of group goals. And here, the way that people construe themselves or think about themselves is more in terms of an interdependent situation. So individuals define themselves rather through the relationships they have with groups or with their peers, with others, with the groups to which they belong. Now remember that in our study, participants were in one of three conditions. This is why we have 6 pairs of bars here. So they were either in the control condition where they were not primed. They were primed with individualistic thoughts or self-construals, or they were primed with a collectivistic story, right, about the warrior and to whom to send to the king. So we have on the leftmost pairs of bars is of citizens from the US in the control condition. Next to that, people from the US in the condition with the individualism priming. And next to that, people from the US in the condition with collectivism priming. And then we have the same 3 conditions again for the people from Hong Kong. Okay, and what we have also is the rating of how much people endorsed individualist versus collectivist values. So that's our dependent variable, remember? So this is what we would see on the y-axis if it actually had a label. And how can we tell apart the individualist versus collectivist values? Well, by the color. So individualist values, the endorsement of these is, or the importance rating is marked in red. So what can we see? For people in the US, so in an individualistic nation, if they weren't primed in the control condition, therefore, if they weren't primed with anything in particular. They endorsed individualistic values more than collectivist values, right? In the group of participants from Hong Kong who were in a control condition, we can see the opposite. So without any interference, they endorsed more primes that, values that were associated with collectivism than values that were individualistic. Okay, so first of all, kind of this is a sanity check. This is what we would have expected in the control condition. What we can also see is that participants from the US, if primed with individualistic values, still valued individualistic values more. But if primed with collectivistic values, the value of these collectivistic values now rose, even slightly above the individualistic values, right? Whether or not that's significant is again hard to tell because there are no error bars here. But we can definitely see that the importance of collectivistic values is increased even in people who are individualistic by nature, so to say. Now, if we look at the Hong Kong participants, we can see that generally in the no prime condition, they value collectivistic values more than individualistic values. This is also the case if we prime them with collectivistic values, then they still value collectivistic values more than individualistic values. But if primed with individualistic values, now the importance of individualistic values rises even a little bit on top, above the collectivistic values, but again, it's difficult to tell if there's a difference here. Let's assume not. So it seems like now suddenly both values are of similar importance for people from Hong Kong, even though naturally they would be more inclined to say that collectivistic values are more important to them. I don't like saying naturally, but yeah, that seems like a wrong way to phrase this. Let me rather rephrase and say, so because of the culture they're from, it seems like on average people endorse more the collectivistic values versus individualistic values. I'm more happy with that formulation. Okay, so what we've seen here is some evidence that we can override people's inclinations to subscribe to certain values by priming the values that are actually sort of on the opposite of the spectrum. So in terms of priming complex things, it's not only possible to prime people's endorsements of specific values, it's also possible to prime people's perception of social roles. So he considered this experiment where participants were primed by either writing about the behavior, lifestyle, appearance, and attributes of a typical professor or of a typical soccer hooligan, or they were in a control condition. And they either worked on this prime on producing a story about this typical professor hooligan for 2 minutes or for 9 minutes. And afterwards, they were asked to answer questions in the Trivial Pursuit game. For instance, who painted the image Las Meninas? And that was the Ladies in Waiting is what the picture is called in English. It's a famous painting hung in Madrid, and they were asked who painted this painting. Now, you could go look it up. I can also tell you that it was Velázquez. And we can take a look at participants' performance in this, wrong direction, in this, still wrong direction, in this Trivial Pursuit game. So, depending on whether they were in the professor or the soccer hooligan condition, right? So we can take a look at how many percent of questions they got right. That's on our dependent variable on the y-axis. Depending on if they were in the professor prime condition, that's on the left, or the soccer hooligan condition, that's on the right, and for how long they dealt with this prime / if they even were exposed to it. That's why we have 6 conditions here. So for people in the professor conditions, the longer they worked on this as compared to not actually being primed, but rather being in a control condition here, we can see that the percentage of correctly answered questions actually increased, while for people who are in a soccer hooligan condition, compared to the baseline here, this is the no prime 2, this is the no prime condition here, compared to this baseline, performance decreased the longer participants were working on the soccer hooligan prime story that they were supposed to write. So here the interpretation would be that priming a social role, either of a person who's good at knowing things in general, or someone who's rather not the academic type, would actually influence participants' behavior in terms of the correctly answered Trivial Pursuit questions. Okay, the last study that we want to take a look at is one that tries to prime goals, and it's entitled "Smells Like Clean Spirit." In this study, participants were asked to complete a lexical decision task. In this lexical decision task, as you remember before, it's about differentiating whether some letters are a word or a non-word. And participants here responded to non-words or control words or neutral words, or words that had something to do with cleaning. And they did that in a specific cubicle where either there was it was a control condition, so just a regular cubicle, or there was a bucket in the corner of this cubicle where 45 milliliters of all-purpose cleaner was in that bucket of warm water, and therefore the scent of this cleaner was diffused throughout that cubicle. So we can now take a look at the response latencies, like how fast were people in differentiating words from non-words, in particular with regard to whether the words had something to do with cleaning or whether they had nothing to do with cleaning, they were just control words. So we here on the y-axis have the response latency, so how long did the participants take to respond to these stimuli, to tell, oh, this is a word or this is not a word. And we have in light blue the control condition, where you can see that participants took about 620 milliseconds for cleaning words, and they took the same amount of time, around about 620 milliseconds, for control words, right? Cleaning words on the left, control words on the right. And in the scent condition, however, the reaction time for control words was kind of similar to the control condition, right? You can see the two bars on the right look pretty close to each other. And now there are error bars, so you can also see that this difference is probably actually not significant. So this is the control words, but the words relevant to the scent condition, which are the cleaning words, we can see here that participants were markedly faster in responding. So the response latencies were much lower in the scent condition for cleaning words than in the control condition for cleaning words. Meaning there would be evidence here, first of all, that the idea of cleaning was somehow activated in participants' minds, it was primed. But we can also see if participants took cleaning activities. So participants went into another room where there was a camera installed, and then judges counted the number of times that participants removed crumbs from the table they were sitting at. This kind of cleaning activity, here we have split up between the scent and the control condition. You can see that participants in the scent condition, they undertook cleaning behavior more often than in the control condition. In addition, you can't see that here, but I can just tell you this: participants were also asked about the purpose of the study and asked if they smelled anything. 6 of the participants were aware that they smelled the cleaner, but they didn't actually think that it had affected their behavior. But in any case, this study would be evidence for a successful prime for cleaning actually also leading to cleaning behavior. So creating the goal in participants to clean up their surroundings. Okay, so this brings us to the end of this lecture, almost. First, I'm going to give you a short overview, and then I have some concluding remarks, so don't skip ahead to the end of the video yet. The last bit is important. So what we've talked about is a lot of evidence that there seems to be some role of automatic behavior in our social judgments and also in our everyday behaviors. So we've talked about the perceiving as for doing perspective, the social role of automatic behavior, and about complex primes. And I've mentioned in between already that there are some studies where the evidence actually doesn't really hold up. Now, why is this important? Because I think that much of the evidence that I've presented to you here actually looks pretty impressive, right? It looks like there are big differences, and it looks like so many tiny things can change our behavior quite radically. However, there have been many replication attempts of studies in this area of behavioral priming, and it turns out that actually we probably know less about the role of automatic behavior today than we thought we knew 5 years ago. So what I want to do now is just read you a short excerpt from Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman speaking about this type of research, this priming research that now I've talked about in this lecture. And he goes to say, all of you know, of course, questions have been raised about the robustness of priming results. The storm of doubts is fed by several sources, including the recent exposure of fraudulent researchers, general concerns with replicability that may affect many disciplines, multiple reported failures to replicate salient results in the priming literature, and the growing belief in the existence of a pervasive file drawer problem that undermines two methodological pillars in your field: the preference for conceptual over literal replication and the use of meta-analysis. Objective observers will point out that the problem could well be more severe in your field than in other branches of experimental psychology, because every priming study involves the invention of new experimental situations. So why am I reading this to you? It is to alert you to the fact that much of the research that I've talked about hasn't been checked again, while some of it that has been checked actually makes us worried that this research wouldn't hold up, the findings wouldn't hold up, that they would either be much less impressive in terms of the sizes of differences that are produced, or that it might actually not be possible to reliably find this specific effect again. So to conclude, I would say that probably priming has less of an influence on our behavior and on our cognitions than the current body of literature suggests. So take what I've said in this lecture with a grain of salt, and think that yes, probably priming does have some influence, but probably it's not quite as big and impressive as it might have looked. And in cases where it does have an influence on behavior, it might still be an adaptive technique to deal with our complex environments, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that we just do crazy behaviors. But what I want to alert you to is the idea that the effects are likely not as big as they seem in these kind of like older research reports that I've shown you here. So if you want to know more about this priming research, this is the ideal place to look for replication studies and to try to understand more whether these findings actually hold up if we try to rerun the same experiment. So that is it with this word of caution, with this idea that probably priming doesn't have such a huge influence, but it's still there, and at least now you know some classical studies and you know some initial ideas for replication. This is where I'm going to end this lecture.